I was fired at 58, and the man who did it couldn't even look me in the eye. He kept his gaze fixed on a folder that didn't belong to him, flipping pages that didn't matter, as if the numbers printed there could justify what he was about to say. "I think it's time for you to step aside, Eleanor," Richard Lawson finally said, his voice smooth in the way people practice when they don't want to sound cruel. "Step aside. Not retire. Not transition. Just disappear." I sat there in that glass-walled conference room I had helped design 15 years ago, staring at the reflection of myself in the polished table. My hands were folded neatly. No shaking. No clenched fists. Just still. Around us, the office carried on like nothing had changed. Phones rang. Laughter echoed faintly from the break room. Life moved forward, as if mine hadn't just been quietly pushed out of it. "Of course," I said. That was all. No argument. No defense. Not even a question. Because the truth was, I had already seen this coming. It wasn't the meeting that surprised me. It was how carefully they had orchestrated it. The past 6 months replayed in my mind like a slow unraveling. Projects I used to lead were reassigned. Meetings I once chaired suddenly happened without me. New faces appeared, young, eager, fast-talking, and I was told they would support me. Support. That word again. I knew what it meant. Replacement, dressed up as kindness. Richard finally looked up, just for a second, like he expected something from me. Anger maybe. Tears. A scene. But I gave him nothing. I stood, adjusted my blazer, and reached for the small box they had already prepared. That was the part that stayed with me. They had packed my desk before I even walked into the room. 30 years reduced to a cardboard box. A framed photo. A pen I'd used since my first promotion. A coffee mug that said, "World's Best Mom," chipped on the handle. I carried it out myself. No one offered to help. No one stopped me. People glanced up, then quickly looked back down at their screens, pretending they hadn't seen. I didn't blame them. Fear does that to people. It teaches them to stay quiet, to stay safe. Outside, the air felt colder than it should have for late spring. I placed the box in the trunk of my car and stood there for a moment, staring at the building. I had walked into those doors for 3 decades. Early mornings, late nights, weekends. I had given that place more than time. I had given it pieces of my life I would never get back. And now, it was done in less than 10 minutes. The drive home was silent. No music. No phone calls. Just the sound of the road beneath the tires and the faint hum of everything I hadn't said. When I walked through my front door, my son was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He looked up, surprised to see me so early. "You're home," he said, like it was an inconvenience. I set the box down by the hallway table. "I was let go," I said simply. He didn't ask how. He didn't ask why. He just nodded, slow and thoughtful, like he was processing something practical instead of something personal. "Maybe it's for the best," he said after a moment. "You've been working a long time, Mom. You should think about retiring." Retiring. The word landed heavier than anything Richard had said. I studied his face, searching for something familiar. The little boy who used to wait by the window when I came home late. The teenager who asked me for advice before every big decision. But all I saw was someone who had already adjusted to a version of me that didn't include purpose. I nodded once. "Maybe," I said. That night, I unpacked the box slowly, placing each item on the kitchen table like evidence. Not of what I had lost, but of what had been taken quietly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for them to remove but me. And as I stood there, in the stillness of my own home, I realized something that hadn't occurred to me in that conference room. They thought they had ended my story, but all they had really done was remove me from theirs. I woke up the next morning at exactly 6:30, the same time I had woken up every weekday for the past 30 years, and for a few seconds, I lay there staring at the ceiling, waiting for the familiar urgency to kick in, the quiet pressure that used to pull me out of bed before the alarm even finished ringing, but it never came. And that was the first moment I understood something had shifted in a way I could not undo. Because for the first time in decades, there was nowhere I needed to be. The house was still, almost too still, the kind of silence that makes every small sound feel louder than it should. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock, even the soft rustle of the sheets when I sat up felt unfamiliar, like I was a guest in my own life. I walked into the kitchen and made coffee the same way I always did. 2 scoops, 12 ounces of water, precise, automatic. But when I poured it into my mug, I realized I had nowhere to take it, No desk waiting for me. No schedule, no emails, no expectations, just an empty stretch of hours I had not asked for. I sat at the table and looked at my phone, half expecting it to light up with a message, maybe from someone at the office, maybe from a client who had heard, but the screen stayed dark, and that silence said more than any words ever could, because it meant they had already moved on, already replaced me, already erased me from the rhythm of their day. By 8 o'clock, I found myself glancing at the clock again, the old instinct still there, calculating what I would normally be doing, which meeting I would be preparing for, which report I would be reviewing, and I caught myself reaching for a pen that was not there, my hand hovering in the air before slowly lowering back to the table. And I had to laugh, not because anything was funny, but because it was the only way to keep the moment from feeling heavier than it already did. Later that morning, I walked past the hallway table and saw the box again, still sitting where I had left it, and something about it felt different in the daylight, less like a symbol of loss and more like a collection of unanswered questions. So I opened it again, slower this time, picking up each item one by one, the photo, the mug, the pen, and then something I had not noticed the night before, a thin folder tucked beneath everything else. I pulled it out carefully, the paper inside crisp, official, deliberate, and as I flipped through it, I felt that same quiet shift again, the kind that does not make noise but changes everything. These were not just exit documents, not just the standard paperwork they give you when you leave. There were notes, project outlines, summaries of initiatives I had led, ideas I had developed over years, ideas that were now listed under the company's future strategy as if they had always belonged to someone else. I read the pages twice, then a third time, slower, more carefully, and with each line, a pattern began to form, not loud, not obvious, but undeniable, because the work I had done, the systems I had built, the relationships I had cultivated, they had not been dismissed, they had been absorbed, repackaged, and reassigned, and suddenly the past 6 months made more sense than I wanted them to. The support I was given, the meetings I was excluded from, the gradual shift in tone, it was never about helping me adjust. It was about transitioning everything I knew to someone else while I was still in the room, watching it happen without realizing what I was really witnessing. I set the folder down and leaned back in my chair, not angry, not even surprised, just aware in a way I had not been before, and that awareness felt sharper than any emotion I could have named, because it meant I could finally see the full picture without needing anyone else to explain it to me. Around noon, my phone buzzed, a number I did not recognize, and for a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something told me to answer, so I did, my voice steady, calm, unchanged, and when the man on the other end introduced himself as a client I had worked with for years, I felt something shift again, not in the room, not in the house, but somewhere quieter, somewhere deeper, because the first thing he said was not about the company, not about the transition, not even about the news of my departure. He said, "Eleanor, I heard what happened, and I need to know one thing. Are you still available to work?" I did not answer right away, not because I did not know what to say, but because I understood, in that moment, that the question itself mattered. More than the answer, because it meant that whatever they thought they had taken from me, whatever they believed they had reassigned or replaced, had not disappeared at all. It had simply followed me out the door, quietly, without announcement, waiting for me to decide what to do with it next. I did not give him an answer right away, and he seemed to understand that, because he did not rush me. He did not fill the silence. He just waited, and that told me more about him than anything he could have said, because people who respect your work also respect your pause. And for the first time since I walked out of that building, I felt something steady return, not confidence, not yet, but clarity, the kind that settles quietly and stays. I said finally, my voice even, measured, unchanged, and there was a small exhale on the other end of the line, almost like relief, like he had been hoping I would say that, but was not sure I would. "Good," he replied, "because I have been trying to get answers from your former team all morning, and no one can explain what you used to handle." I let that sit between us for a second, not as a point of pride, but as confirmation of something I had already begun to suspect, that what I carried with me was not just experience, it was structure, understanding, the invisible framework that holds everything together when no one is paying attention. He continued, outlining a situation that sounded familiar, a project timeline slipping, decisions being delayed, small issues compounding into larger ones. The kind of slow unraveling that does not make headlines but eventually brings everything to a stop. And as he spoke, I found myself picturing it clearly, not because I was guessing, but because I had seen it before, prevented it before, fixed it before, and I realized I still knew exactly what needed to be done. "I can take a look," I said, keeping it simple, not offering more than necessary. And he agreed immediately, almost too quickly, as if he had already decided before calling me, and we set a time to meet the next day. After I hung up, I remained at the table, the folder still open beside me, the pages no longer just evidence of what had been taken, but context for what remained. And I understood then that nothing in those pages actually belonged to them, not in the way they thought it did, because ideas without the person who built them are just outlines, incomplete, waiting for someone who understands how they fit together. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly, but it was a different kind of quiet than the morning, less hollow, more focused, and I found myself moving through the house with intention, clearing a space at the dining table, organizing the documents I had, opening my laptop for the first time since leaving the office, the screen lighting up in a way that felt familiar, almost grounding, and as I logged in, I noticed how quickly my hands remembered where everything was, how easily the patterns returned, like they had been waiting just beneath the surface. Later that evening, my son walked into the kitchen while I was reviewing notes, and he paused when he saw me, not because of what I was doing, but because of how I looked doing it, focused, present, engaged, and there was a flicker of something in his expression I could not quite name, maybe surprise, maybe confusion, like he had not expected to see me like this again so soon. "I thought you were taking it easy," he said, leaning against the doorway, his tone casual but edged with something else, something quieter. I glanced up briefly, then back down at the screen. "I am," I replied, and I meant it, because this did not feel like pressure, it did not feel like obligation, it felt like choice. And that made all the difference. He nodded slowly, as if trying to reconcile that with what he believed, then shrugged and walked away, and I let him, because I understood something now that I had not fully understood before, that people adjust to the version of you that is most convenient for them, and when that version changes, it takes time for them to catch up, if they ever do at all. That night, I reviewed everything one more time, not to prove anything, not to prepare for a confrontation, but to remind myself of what I already knew. And as I closed my laptop and turned off the lights, I felt that same steady clarity settle deeper, not loud, not dramatic, just present, and I realized that for the first time since I had been asked to step aside, I was no longer thinking about what I had lost, I was thinking about what I still had, and more importantly, what I could do with it. The next morning, I arrived 10 minutes early, not because I needed to prove anything, but because I have always believed that time is one of the few things you control completely, and I was not about to start losing that now. The building was smaller than I expected, a modest glass front tucked between two larger offices, but there was a quiet sense of order to it, the kind you only notice when it is missing somewhere else. Inside, the receptionist greeted me by name before I even introduced myself, and that alone told me something about the way this place was run, because details like that do not happen by accident. When I was led into the conference room, I noticed there were no elaborate displays, no oversized presentations prepared to impress me, just a table, a laptop, and 3 people who stood up when I walked in, and for a moment, I had to pause, because respect, when you have not felt it in a while, has a way of catching you off guard. "Eleanor, thank you for coming," the client said, extending his hand, and I shook it firmly, meeting his eyes without hesitation, not as someone asking for an opportunity, but as someone deciding whether to accept one. We sat, and he began to explain the situation in more detail, outlining delays, miscommunication, overlapping responsibilities that no one seemed to own, and as he spoke, I listened carefully, not interrupting, not correcting, just observing, because the pattern was already forming in my mind before he finished the first few minutes. When he finally paused, expecting questions, I did not ask any. Instead, I turned the laptop slightly toward me and began outlining what I saw, step by step, not dramatically, not to impress, but clearly, precisely, the way I had done it hundreds of times before, identifying the breakdown points, the inefficiencies, the missing accountability, and as I spoke, I noticed the shift in the room, the way their posture changed, the way their attention sharpened, because what had been confusion a moment ago was now starting to take shape. You are not dealing with a resource issue, I said calmly. You are dealing with a structure issue. And I could see it land, not as a guess, but as recognition, and I continued, mapping out a solution that did not require adding more people or extending deadlines, but simply restoring clarity to the system that had quietly unraveled. No one interrupted me. No one challenged me. They just listened, and when I finished, there was a brief silence, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that follows understanding, and then the client leaned back slightly, nodding once. That is exactly what has been happening, he said, almost to himself, and then he looked at me again, this time differently, not with curiosity, but with certainty. How soon can you start? He asked. I did not answer immediately, not because I needed time, but because I understood the weight of that question, because starting meant stepping into something new without fully knowing where it would lead, and for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty did not feel like risk, it felt like possibility. I can begin today, I said, and I meant it, not as a promise to them, but as a decision for myself. We discussed the details briefly, timelines, expectations, access, and everything moved quickly, efficiently, without unnecessary negotiation, because when people recognize value, they do not hesitate, they align. When the meeting ended, I gathered my things, standing up with the same calm I had carried in, but as I reached the door, the client stopped me for a moment. Eleanor, he said, and I turned back, meeting his gaze. We should have called you sooner, he added, and I held his eyes for a second before responding, not with reassurance, not with regret, just with truth. You called at the right time, I said, and I walked out, the words settling behind me as quietly as everything else had that morning. On the drive home, I did not feel relief, and I did not feel triumph, because this was not about proving anyone wrong. It was about recognizing what had always been there, what had never actually been taken, only overlooked, and as I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, I sat there for a moment, hands resting on the wheel, understanding something that had not been clear before, that the door they closed on me had not ended anything. It had simply redirected everything I was capable of into a space where it could finally be seen again. The first few days moved quickly, not in a chaotic way, but in a steady rhythm that felt almost familiar, like stepping back into a language I had not spoken out loud in a while, but still understood completely, and I found myself settling into it without effort, reviewing systems, clarifying roles, making small adjustments that did not look dramatic on the surface, but began shifting everything underneath. Because that is how real change works, not loud, not sudden, but precise. Each morning, I arrived at the same time, greeted the same receptionist who now smiled a little wider when she saw me, and walked into the same conference room that no longer felt like a temporary space, but something closer to a base, a place where things started to make sense again. The team was attentive, not because they had to be, but because they were beginning to see the difference. The way decisions no longer lingered unresolved. The way responsibilities became clear instead of overlapping. And I noticed how quickly people respond when confusion is replaced with direction. How tension eases when expectations are no longer uncertain. By the third day, the client called me into his office, not for a problem, but for an update. And that alone was telling, because when things are broken, meetings are reactive, but when they begin to stabilize, people start looking ahead again. We are already seeing improvement, he said, leaning forward slightly, his tone measured but unmistakably satisfied, and I nodded, not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging what I already knew would happen once the structure was restored. He hesitated for a moment, then added, I have had 2 other departments reach out, asking if you could review their processes as well, and I held his gaze calmly, understanding the implication without needing him to say it directly. Because this was how it starts, not with an announcement, not with a title, but with demand that grows quietly until it can no longer be ignored. We can discuss scope and timing, I replied, keeping it simple, because I was not interested in rushing anything, not anymore, and he nodded, almost relieved by my answer, like he expected urgency but found something steadier instead. That afternoon, as I worked through another set of documents, my phone buzzed again. and this time the number was familiar, the company line I had known for years, and for a moment, I just looked at it, letting it ring once, twice, 3 times, before I answered, my voice unchanged, neutral, controlled. Eleanor. Richard's voice came through, smooth as ever, but there was something beneath it now, something less certain, less practiced, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, not reacting, not prompting, just listening. I heard you have been consulting, he continued, the words chosen carefully, as if he was testing how much I would confirm without being asked directly, and I allowed a brief pause before responding. I have been working, I said, and the distinction was intentional, because consulting suggests something temporary, something secondary, and that was not what this was. There was another pause, longer this time, and I could almost picture him adjusting in his chair, recalibrating the conversation he had planned. We have been experiencing some challenges since your departure, he admitted finally, the phrasing polite but the meaning clear, and I said nothing, because silence, when used correctly, has a way of inviting the truth out without force. I would like to discuss the possibility of you coming back, perhaps in a more flexible capacity, he added, and there it was, not an apology, not an acknowledgement, but an offer shaped to sound like an opportunity, and I closed my eyes for a brief second, not out of frustration, but to fully understand the moment, because this was not about the job, it was about the shift, the quiet reversal of positions that had happened without announcement. I opened my eyes again, steady, clear, and answered without hesitation. I am not available, I said, my tone even, not sharp, not emotional, just final, and on the other end, there was a silence that felt different from the ones before, heavier, less controlled, like something had slipped beyond his ability to manage it. I understand, he said after a moment, though it was clear that he did not fully, not yet, and when the call ended, I set the phone down gently and returned to my work, not with satisfaction, not with resentment, but with a sense of alignment that had not been there before, because for the first time in a long time, I was not reacting to what someone else had decided for me. I was moving forward based on what I had chosen for myself. The following week unfolded in a way that felt both new and strangely familiar, as if I had stepped into a version of my life that had always been possible, but had been waiting quietly for the right moment to appear, and each day brought a steady expansion of what had begun as a single conversation into something larger, something structured, something real. The initial project stabilized faster than expected, not because it was simple, but because once clarity is restored, progress follows naturally, and by the end of the week, the team no longer looked to me with uncertainty. They looked with trust, the kind that forms when people begin to rely on outcomes instead of promises. Additional departments started reaching out, not through formal channels, but through quiet introductions, brief messages, short calls that always began the same way, with hesitation, followed by recognition, followed by a request that sounded less like a favor and more like a need. I did not rush to accept everything, and that was a decision I made deliberately, because I understood now that saying yes to everything is how you lose control of your own direction, and I had no intention of doing that again, not at this stage, not after everything that had led me here. Instead, I chose carefully, one engagement at a time, focusing on where I could create real impact, where the work mattered, where the results would not be hidden behind someone else's name. At home, the change was quieter but just as noticeable, not in what I said, but in how I moved, how I carried myself, how I no longer filled silence with explanations or justifications, and my son began to observe that difference in ways he did not comment on directly, but that showed in small moments, the way he lingered a little longer in the kitchen, the way he asked questions that were less about concern and more about understanding. One evening, as I was reviewing a set of timelines at the dining table, he sat across from me, watching for a moment before speaking. So this is more than just a temporary thing, he said, not as a question, but as a realization, and I looked up, meeting his eyes calmly. It is exactly what I choose it to be, I replied, and there was a brief pause as he absorbed that, adjusting his understanding not just of what I was doing, but of who I was in this new context, and I could see the shift, subtle but real, as the assumption he had made days earlier began to lose its place. He nodded slowly, then leaned back slightly, as if seeing me from a different distance than before. I did not realize, he said quietly, and I did not ask him to finish that sentence, because I already knew what he meant, and more importantly, I no longer needed to hear it said out loud. By the end of the second week, I had formalized what had begun as a single engagement into something structured, registering a small consulting business under my name. Nothing elaborate, nothing performative, just a simple declaration that what I was doing was no longer temporary, no longer incidental, but intentional. The paperwork was straightforward, the process efficient, and as I signed my name on the final document, I felt a sense of clarity that did not come from starting something new, but from recognizing something that had always been there, something I had simply not claimed before. The calls continued, the work expanded, and with each new project, the pattern repeated, confusion replaced by structure, hesitation replaced by direction, and I noticed how consistently the same issues appeared in different forms, not because organizations are identical, but because the principles that hold them together are, and understanding those principles is what separates temporary solutions from lasting ones. Late one afternoon, as I prepared to leave the office of a new client, the receptionist stopped me briefly, smiling in a way that felt familiar now. "They seem different since you started coming here," she said, not as a formal observation, but as something she had noticed in the rhythm of the place, and I returned the smile, not correcting her, not explaining, just acknowledging, because sometimes the most accurate assessments come from those who are not directly involved, those who simply witness the change as it happens. On the drive home, the sun lower in the sky, the road quiet, I realized that what had once felt like an ending had fully transformed into something else entirely, something that did not depend on a title, a company, or someone else's approval, but on something far more stable, something that had remained unchanged through all of it. And for the first time, I was not measuring my progress by where I had been, but by how clearly I could see where I was going. By the third week, the calls no longer felt like inquiries. They felt like a pattern unfolding, one that moved quietly but with increasing momentum, and I began to notice something I had not expected, not just that my work was being recognized, but that it was being sought out before I even introduced myself, as if my absence from one place had made my presence more visible everywhere else. One morning, as I was reviewing a proposal at the dining table, my phone rang again, and this time the voice on the other end was more direct, less hesitant, the kind of tone that comes from someone who has already made a decision before the conversation even begins. "We were told you are the person who fixes things when they start to slip," the man said, and I paused for a moment, not because I needed to think about how to respond, but because I understood the weight of that sentence, because it was not just a description of what I do. It was a recognition of how I had been perceived all along, even when I was no longer being acknowledged for it. "I take a look at systems," I replied simply, keeping the language neutral, because I had learned that the way you describe your work shapes how others value it, and I was no longer interested in minimizing what I brought to the table. That afternoon, I met with his team, a different office, a different environment, but the same underlying issue, a structure that had begun to fracture in small ways that no one had addressed until the cracks became visible, and as I listened, observed, and then outlined what needed to change, I saw the same shift happen again, the same quiet moment when confusion gives way to understanding, and it became clear that this was no longer an isolated opportunity. It was something repeatable, something consistent, something I could build around with intention. Later that week, I received an email that caught my attention, not because of who it was from, but because of what it contained, a formal request for a long-term engagement, not just a short-term review or a temporary fix, but an ongoing role in shaping how an organization operated moving forward, and I read it twice, then closed the laptop for a moment, letting the significance of it settle, because this was different. This was not about stepping in to solve a problem and then stepping away. This was about being invited to influence the direction of something over time, and I understood that accepting it would change the pace of everything. That evening, my son joined me at the table again, this time without hesitation, sitting down across from me as if it had become part of his routine, and for a moment, he just watched, the way people do when they are trying to understand something that has shifted in front of them. "You seem busier now than before," he said, not critically, not even curiously, just stating what he observed, and I looked up, meeting his eyes with a calm that felt natural now. "I am more focused," I replied, and there was a difference between the two that I knew he could hear, even if he had not yet fully defined it for himself. He nodded slowly, then leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "I think I misunderstood," he said after a moment, his voice quieter than usual, and I did not rush to respond, because understanding, when it arrives, needs space to settle, and I had learned not to interrupt that process. "It is easy to do," I said finally, not as reassurance, but as acknowledgement, and that seemed to be enough, because he nodded again, this time more certain, and the conversation did not need to go further than that. As the days continued, I formalized more of what I had been doing, refining how I structured my time, how I selected projects, how I defined the scope of my work, not to limit it, but to give it shape, because without structure, even opportunity can become overwhelming, and I was no longer willing to let anything operate without clarity, including my own path. One afternoon, as I was organizing a set of contracts, I paused and looked at the stack of documents in front of me, each one representing a different company, a different team, a different problem that had been handed to me with the same expectation, that I would see what others had missed, that I would bring order where there had been none, and I realized that what I was building was not just a series of engagements. It was a position, one that did not depend on a single organization, but on something far more stable, something that could not be taken away with a meeting, a decision, or a title. And as I sat there, the afternoon light coming through the window, quiet and steady, I understood something that had not been clear when I first walked out of that office with a box in my hands, that the value I carried had never been tied to where I worked. It had always been tied to what I understood, and now, for the first time, it was fully mine to direct. By the end of the first month, the pace of everything had changed in a way that no longer felt temporary, and I could see it not just in the number of calls or the contracts on my table, but in the way conversations began, because people were no longer asking if I could help. They were asking when I would be available, and that subtle shift carried more weight than any title I had ever held. One morning, as I was reviewing a long-term engagement proposal, my phone rang again, and this time I recognized the number immediately, not because it appeared often, but because it had been part of my routine for so many years that it still felt familiar even after weeks of silence. I let it ring once, then answered, my voice steady, unchanged. "Eleanor," Richard said, and there was no attempt this time to soften his tone or disguise his intent, just a directness that had not been there before, as if the situation had moved beyond pretense. "We need to talk," he added, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, listening without responding, allowing him to continue. "We have lost 2 major clients in the past 3 weeks, he said, the words measured but carrying a strain he could not fully conceal, and I understood immediately what that meant, not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of structure, because clients do not leave all at once without a deeper reason. Behind it, they cited operational inconsistencies, he continued, and I could almost map the issues in my mind as he spoke, the gaps, the delays, the misalignments that had once been contained but were now exposed without anyone there to hold them together. There was a brief pause. Then he said something he had not said before. "We underestimated your role, and I did not react, not because it did not matter, but because I had already moved beyond needing that acknowledgement to validate what I knew. I would like to meet," he added, more carefully now, "in person." I considered the request for a moment, not weighing whether I should go, but understanding why he was asking, because this was no longer about an offer. It was about a realization that had come too late to be managed through a phone call. "I have availability on Thursday at 10, I said, my tone neutral, and he agreed immediately, as if he had been waiting for any opening I would give him. When the call ended, I set the phone down and returned to the proposal in front of me, not rushing, not distracted, because the meeting did not change what I was already building. It simply added another moment to it. The days leading up to Thursday moved with the same steady rhythm. Meetings, calls, decisions, each one reinforcing the structure I had put in place for myself, and by the time Thursday arrived, the meeting felt less like a return and more like a checkpoint, something to observe rather than something to engage emotionally with. When I walked into the building, everything looked the same, the glass walls, the reception desk, the quiet movement of people behind their screens, but there was a difference I could not see at first, something in the air, something in the way people glanced up a little longer than before, as if my presence now carried a different meaning than it had when I was part of the routine. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile, but there was a pause, just a fraction of a second, before she spoke, and I recognized it immediately, not as hesitation, but as recognition, the kind that comes when someone realizes they are looking at the same person in a different role. Richard was already in the conference room when I entered, standing instead of sitting, and as I stepped inside, he moved forward, extending his hand, his expression composed but no longer entirely controlled. "Thank you for coming," he said, and I shook his hand briefly, taking a seat without waiting for an invitation, not out of defiance, but because the dynamic had already shifted, and we both understood that. He began to speak almost immediately, outlining the challenges, the losses, the urgency, but I listened the same way I always had, without interruption, without reaction, allowing him to present everything he needed to say before I responded, because I knew that what mattered was not how much he explained, but what I chose to do with it. When he finished, there was a silence, not uncomfortable, not tense, just clear, and in that moment, I saw something I had not seen before, not in him, but in the situation itself, because the man who had once asked me to step aside was now sitting across from me, not as someone in control, but as someone trying to regain it, and I realized that nothing about this moment was accidental. It was the natural outcome of everything that had been set in motion the day I walked out of this room with a box in my hands, and now, for the first time, I was the one deciding what came next. Richard did not speak right away after finishing his explanation, and I could see why, because he had already said everything he thought would justify the situation, everything that would frame the problem as something external, something manageable, something that could be corrected if the right person stepped back in. But what he had not addressed was the part that could not be adjusted, the decision that had set all of this in motion in the first place. I let the silence remain for a moment longer, not to create tension, but to allow the reality of it to settle, because sometimes what is not said carries more clarity than anything that is. Then I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the table, and spoke in the same tone I had used in every meeting since I walked out of this building, calm, measured, precise. "You do not have a client problem," I said, and his eyes shifted slightly, the way they do when someone recognizes the direction of a conversation before it fully unfolds. "You have a continuity problem," I continued, and I could see it land, not as new information, but as something he already understood but had not yet fully accepted. I outlined it clearly, not as criticism, but as structure, the loss of internal alignment, the breakdown in decision flow, the absence of a central point that understood how everything connected, and as I spoke, I noticed he was no longer trying to explain, no longer trying to redirect, he was listening, and that alone told me more than anything he could have said. When I finished, there was a pause, and then he nodded once, slower than before. "That is why I need you back," he said, more directly this time, without framing it as flexibility or opportunity, just a clear statement of intent, and I held his gaze, not reacting immediately, because the answer had already formed long before I walked into this room. "You do not need me back?" I replied, my voice steady, not confrontational, just clear, and I saw the brief flicker of confusion cross his expression, not because he disagreed, but because he had not expected that response. "You needed me to stay," I added, and this time I let the words sit between us without filling the space that followed, because the difference mattered, not as a correction, but as a reality that could not be reversed. He leaned back slightly, exhaling in a way that was less controlled than before, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, because there was nothing left to clarify. "Then help us fix it," he said after a moment, adjusting his approach, shifting from authority to request, and I recognized the change immediately, not in the words, but in the position he had moved into, and I considered it briefly, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to respond with the same clarity I had carried through every step of this process. "I can work with you as an external consultant," I said finally, outlining the terms simply, without embellishment, without negotiation in my tone, just a structure that reflected where things stood now, and I watched as he processed that, understanding what it meant, not just in cost or arrangement, but in position, because this was no longer about returning to what had been, it was about engaging with what existed now, and those were not the same thing. He nodded slowly, accepting it, because he had no reason not to, and we discussed the details briefly: timelines, scope, access, everything handled with the same efficiency that had once defined our work together, but now without the assumptions that had once framed it. When the meeting ended, I stood, gathering my things, and as I reached the door, he spoke again, quieter this time. "Eleanor," he said, and I turned back, meeting his eyes one last time. And there was something different there now, not authority, not even urgency, but recognition, the kind that arrives only after something has been fully understood, often too late to change it. "I made a mistake," he said, and I held his gaze for a moment, not to respond, not to correct, just to acknowledge that the moment existed, because acknowledgement, when it comes this late, is not something you build on, it is something you accept and move past. I gave a small nod, nothing more, and turned to leave, walking out of the room the same way I had walked out weeks before, calm, steady, composed, but this time without carrying anything in my hands, because there was nothing left to take with me. And as I stepped outside into the afternoon light, I understood something with complete clarity, that what had once felt like the end of everything had not taken anything from me at all. It had simply revealed what had been mine all along, and now, for the first time, I was the one deciding exactly where it would go next.